No matter whether your problem is contact, direction, or power, I'm going to run you through the top 5 most common problems amateur golfers face and how a gear tie helps solve them. Let's go. Number 1, pitch control. What do I mean by pitch control? And when you mis-execute it, what problems show up? By pitch control, I'm talking about what plane of motion this shaft works on through the downswing. Most amateur golfers will come into impact having the club pitch too steep. They've got to get out of that steep. By reverse rolling the club too late in the golf swing, it'll compromise their contact, oftentimes thin, sometimes toe, or sometimes shank, meaning a malady of all contact errors. Just as much so, the shaft will pitch this direction, opening the face, and they'll send it out to right field. So we have to build an awareness of how we're moving that club through the backswing into transition to clean up that pitch control, and here's how a twist tie is going to be used. We're going to take the twist tie, we're going to put it around our bicep, just like so. Little clip on the bicep. Now what we're trying to do here is we're trying to move the shaft up in line with the twist tie, or even on my face, my head side of the twist tie in the backswing, and then move the shaft down into the twist tie in transition. That moves me from relatively steep to relatively shallow, lining this shaft up for a nice clean, efficient delivery. And yes, it works in live fire, so I would recommend rehearsing it. So there's inside the twist tie, the shaft on my head side of the twist tie. There's me moving back towards the twist tie in rehearsal. That's me moving that shaft from steep to shallow. The earlier you line that thing up, the less problem you have with club face, and importantly, the less problem you're going to have with contact. So let's review it again. We got twist tie somewhere around the middle of your bicep. It's basically parallel to the ground. It's basically perpendicular to the line of my body, and it's extending out probably 8 to 12 inches in front of me. The longer it is, the better it is, because it's going to get in the way of that shaft that's trying to pitch incorrectly in the opposite direction that you want it to. So you want the twist tie long enough such that it's giving you that positive versus negative feedback to the control through your forearms of that club shaft. So that's number 1. Let's jump to number 2. Number 2, scoop. More technically known as added dynamic loft or excessive dynamic loft. What do we mean by scoop or excessive dynamic loft? I'm talking about the player that gets towards impact and is letting the club head pass underneath the handle excessively. What problem does this lead to? It leads to shorter distance than you otherwise could achieve. It leads to a greater chance that you're going to hit the ground before you get to the ball. So we got fats, and we've got high launching, short, particularly your most lofted irons are going to travel short if you've got excessive scoop, excessive dynamic loft. So what creates this is a sense that your handle's slowing down and your trail hand is pushing on the bottom side of the grip. That's called an in-plane rotation, right? This is the swing plane that we're swinging on. We're kicking the club head underneath the handle excessively, and here's how a twist tie is going to help us solve your scoop, cause you to strike it more solid and achieve greater distance strictly because you're delivering lower dynamic loft. So here's how it's going to work. We're going to wrap the twist tie around the top part of our lead wrist. We'll create this little hook to keep it in place. It doesn't have to be too tight. At address, we want some amount extending such that it's touching the inside of our trail forearm. So we have this junction or triangle, the stability of that triangle essentially built. What we want is we want the experience of that triangle continuing to stay at the same width that it was at address all the way through impact before we crush this, this gear tie. So best practice is to start short. And by the way, I'm creating a hook only because it's accommodating the distance. If yours is straight, that's a-okay. It just means that it's a little bit shorter between your forearms here. So best practice is to start short swing, keeping this twist tie away from your trail forearm. Don't crush it, just like so. Okay, so I've got a really low launching punch shot there. That's teaching you to adapt or improve that low dynamic loft condition before you graduate into a full swing. Now invariably you're going to move this twist tie around the follow through, so just readjust it when you get back into your address position. So you've got your structure in place, and now we're going to swing full. Okay, so the feedback this is giving me is I didn't feel my trail forearm touch that twist tie until well into the follow through when I began to crush it. Come back to address, it's smaller than it was when I was at address. I readjust it and I'm ready to go again. So twist tie on the lead forearm, return with lower dynamic loft by avoiding crushing your little junction or your little twist tie right here, and you're bound to start hitting more solid, meaning less fat, and greater distance iron shots because you're delivering a lower dynamic loft. That's number 2. Number 3, early extension during your swing. Most of the time that happens in the downswing. Number 1, what do I mean by early extension? And number 2, what sort of problems does it cause? What I mean by early extension is we start at address. Most golfers know how to get into the correct bends. That's bend in the knees, bend from your hip joint. So we'll call this hip flexion. And then the arms hang down quite nicely. Returning to impact, ideally we want to be moving through those same bend angles roughly. So early extension would be any amount of straightening that occurs. That could be straightening through the knees. More often, that's straightening at the hip joint, which thrusts the pelvis forward, changes the vertical plane, makes contact uber difficult because as your hips are thrusting or extending, right, extending at this joint right here, your rib cage is moving further away from the ground. That lifts the bottom of the arc. Contact becomes challenging. Oftentimes it's associated with more open faces, and you guessed it, thins shots out to the right. Common amateur problem. So now let's get to how a twist tie is going to help us solve this problem. So how this is going to work, we're going to take a piece of twist tie. It's about 12-13 inches long, almost the distance from my elbow to my fingers. We're going to wrap it underneath my belt. Then we're going to have about 6 or 7 inches sticking out in front of my belt. And then at address, it should be angled down roughly at the pitch of the shaft, roughly pointing down to my golf ball. And it shouldn't at any point extend a longer distance down to where it's touching the handle. So what does early extension look like? It looks like this, where I begin to move the gear tie more level to the ground, and I'm thrusting the gear tie forward, and you can see what's going to happen. If I do it incorrectly, the gear tie is going to get in the way of the hand path, and so therefore, there lies what we're trying to do. We're trying to avoid that gear tie coming into contact with my handle by moving the pelvis backward and also tipping it down ever so slightly, just making sure it's moving back to the same amount of bend that we started with. So live fire, but before we go live fire, let's go rehearsal. So there's me moving back into some amount of flex and some amount of movement backwards with my pelvis. And that's me getting out of any thrust, any early extension, because I'm trying to avoid the gear tie moving forward and changing angles to where it gets level to the ground. So now you know how to solve your early extension. It's going to help you improve your contact and also, in all likelihood, solve any degree of excessive open face. Number 5 is going to solve the most common amateur problem. So don't click off, stay with me. Number 4, a close cousin to the early extension, is how this trail leg behaves. Some people call it Elvis leg, right? Knee kicks forward. Some people call it kickstand, where this knee kicks forward, shoves the pelvis forward, independent of just the early extension. So misbehavior here creates a similar contact problem, similar face problem as the early extension on number 3. But remember, stay with me because number 5 is super important for you to understand and apply. But let's see how we can use a gear tie to help solve Elvis leg, give us more space at the bottom so we're not fighting the handle coming into impact and making a nice clean impact. Here's how it works. So we're going to take a gear tie. This one's 24 inches long. I'm going to wrap it around just above your back knee, so trail leg, and about 5 inches of it is sticking out, running parallel to the target line. And so what would this look like done incorrectly if I Elvis knee it forward? I get the gear tie or the twist tie, however you want to term these things, because they're called the same thing depending upon what shop you're at, is I get it forward and it moves in front of my lead leg through the downswing. So the objective then becomes, how can I make this gear tie move behind my lead leg? That keeps my trail thigh backwards, right? So I'm not thrusting forwards, and also causes this trail leg and trail hip to behave, moving through its rotation nice and properly, so we don't face that thrust that happens because of the trail leg misbehavior and then the contact and face control issues that result. So there's the rehearsal, thrust, reverse, backwards, and then rotate in. So done correctly, I look down and that gear tie is pointed directly back behind me, just like so. Number 5, I promised you, the most common of all recreational amateur mistakes is leaving the face open. So we're going to use a gear tie to help us solve the squaring of the face such that you're not fighting that crop duster slice. At minimum, you're hitting controllable fades, or possibly you've shifted that fade all the way into that nice pretty draw. So there are really 2 mechanisms and 2 phases of the swing that create the squaring necessary to prevent that crop duster slice. The first phase, we can call it from transition to mid downswing. The second phase, we can call it mid downswing to impact. Now, the fundamental movement that we're going to be using the gear tie to solve occurs in this early phase of the motion, early phase of the downswing, that is. Whereas most recreational players don't move their lead forearm and lead wrist into any amount of what's called flexion or bowing as they're transitioning. And you can see the impact of not doing this, or the impact it would have on the club face when I just rotate it back the other way. So that's a club face that's working very parallel to the path that it's swinging on. And that by definition is very, very open to where I want to get the club face pointed by the time I get to the golf ball. Well, right here I have about 1/10 of a second to do the work, which would then be grip twisting work to get the face square. But following a principle of it's always easier to do our work early to make impact that much more repeatable, more consistent, and more likely, we want to do the work in transition, and that work is a movement from whatever your wrist angle here is in the backswing to some increasing amount of lead wrist flexion. So here's how we're going to set up a gear tie to help us solve that late open face that causes us to suffer from that crop duster slice. We're going to take a gear tie, we're going to wrap it around our lead wrist, and you get about 5 inches, possibly even 6 inches. Longer is okay. And we're going to take that and we're going to wrap it right between our ring finger and our middle finger, and then we're going to curl the end around so the end of it is at least up at the same level of our fingers, just like so. Okay, so at address, the distance between where I've got this gear tie hooked on my wrist and then where it's curled around my middle finger there is shorter than when I fully flex my wrist. And so that's the feedback that we're looking for throughout that transition phase, that there's some stretch to this. If at any point in time this causes pain, it's likely because you've got this segment of it wrapped around your wrist a little bit tight, or you don't have quite enough distance here, because we want enough distance to where there's slack, but also we want that experience of stretch going on. And it only needs to stretch that 3 to possibly 7 degrees, so that's about that much motion in transition for us to move that club face into a more closed situation or square situation in the downswing. And so then the drill becomes easy. It's address, it's top of swing, it's feel that stretch in the gear tie that moves that wrist into an increased amount of flexion, and then we move on through impact. And that was an easy draw. I felt that draw happening through the middle of the downswing. And then you'll take that segmented swing, and then you can turn it into a rehearsal and live fire. Very much felt that gear tie stretch in transition, ball takes off and has incentive to draw. And importantly, I felt that sensation of draw happening in transition, which tells me I've done my work early and tells me that this gear tie is going to help you solve the bane of every amateur golfer, which is that crop duster slice. So give it a try.